I'm going to give you some context for the novel, and then I'm going to point out some key parts and passages that I want you to think about. Okay, so Seasonal Migration in the North was published in 1966 and published in English translation in 1969. It's an interesting time for a novel like this to appear in the history of Sudan because it's roughly a decade after decolonization, which I'll say more about in a minute. Now, Salih, in some ways, is kind of like the characters that we encounter in Seasonal Migration to the North. He was born and raised in northern Sudan, graduated from the University of Khartoum, and then he moved to the UK to pursue higher education at the University of London. He later worked for BBC's Arabic service. He wrote a weekly column for an Arabic newspaper in London, and he worked with UNESCO. So, in addition to being a novelist, he was very much involved in communications and in politics. In UNESCO, he was a representative of the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. So he, like some of the other figures that we've been talking about, is sort of one of these, literary statesmen as well, although he didn't occupy a position like Aimé Césaire did, for example. So Sudan, becomes part of British Empire as a result of that, as part of the fallout of that. It achieved independence in 1956, first through kind of a declaration in 1953, and then the gradual handover was completed in 1956. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that the country was culturally divided. The North was primarily Muslim, the South was primarily Christian. And so from the very beginning of the post-colonial period, South Sudan wanted to be its own nation, or at least its own kind of federation. Um, and that was suppressed. So it wasn't until 2011, after a series of civil wars, that South Sudan declared itself independent from Northern Sudan, which is just referred to today as Sudan. Seasonal Migration to the North was written in that first decade following Sudan's independence. And the storyline of the nameless narrator, so we'll talk more about that in a minute, but there are two levels of narration. There's the story of Mustafa Saeed and the story of the narrator with which we begin. That plot line takes place in this post-colonial period, within that decade of the late 50s, early 1960s. Whereas Mustafa Saeed's story that he reflects on when he goes to England takes place in the interwar period, before World War II, right? So we get indications of kind of the roaring 20s in London. In many ways, you could say that Heart of Darkness is an important kind of reference point for Seasonal Migration to the North. And some have argued that Seasonal Migration to the North is sort of a rewriting of Heart of Darkness, in which the direction and location of darkness is actually reversed. So in this case, we could say that Mustafa Saeed travels north on the Nile River before finally arriving in London, where he descends into violence and barbarism brought on by racist and Orientalist world that he inhabits there. In this way, you could say that Saeed could be understood as a kind of Kurtz-like figure, right? Whose brilliant ability to conform to demands of the savage part of the world, in this case, London, ultimately leads to his self-destruction. There are plenty of references in the novel to Heart of Darkness. Things like the two levels of narration seems to echo the structure of Heart of Darkness, descriptions of the river and moving up the river, even the openings of chapters where you have sentences like the steamer swung round on itself seems to call to mind some very similar openings in Heart of Darkness. And then this reference to the germ of empire that I'm going to have us look at in a moment, that we talked about when we read Heart of Darkness, or oftentimes Seasonal Migration in the North uses this idea of the disease or the infection of imperialism. So this is something that, kind of parallels the way that imperialism is talked about in Heart of Darkness. That said, I don't want to overemphasize this to the extent that we understand this novel to be somehow derivative of Heart of Darkness. I think rather we should say it is structurally in dialogue with Conrad's novel and writes back against it, challenging the direction of so-called darkness and barbarism. Now, the other important intertext or allusion, in this novel is Shakespeare's play Othello. If you haven't read Othello or you don't know anything about it, the title character, Othello, is a black Moor who is able to advance in Italian society and gain a certain amount of prestige. He marries a white woman, and he is goaded into jealousy and eventually into murderous rage by his rival, who is disturbed by the way that Othello has advanced. And this eventually leads him to murder his wife and kill himself. So this reference to Othello, to Mustafa Saeed being like Othello, is something that is interesting, not only because Othello is a kind of charismatic and sympathetic character up until the end, but also because, that is to say, just like Mustafa Saeed, but it's also interesting because he is not Othello, right? He doesn't he carries out the murder, but he doesn't carry out the suicide, which is significant, unless we want to interpret his death as suicide, but that's debatable. His death at the river seems to be much more potentially just a drowning, happenstance. But that moment with Jane Morse in which she wants to reenact this Othello Desdemona murder suicide does not take place as, quote, scripted. Finally, I think it's really important for us to bring, Fanon's black skin, white masks to the table when we analyze this text, and also Edward Said's Orientalism. I'm not going to say anything about what Orientalism means in this video, but I will have expected you to have read the part of Orientalism that I assigned and looked at the other videos and definition that I supplied on Blackboard. Now, Orientalism is written at least, over a decade after Season of Migration to the North, but nevertheless, both of these texts are engaging with the problem of Orientalism. Okay, so I want to say a couple things about the two levels of narration that in some ways, replicates the levels of narration that we get between Marlowe and Kurtz. In this case, we have a sense of, if Mustafa Saeed is like Kurtz, we get much more from him than we ever got of Kurtz. So it's not an easy, one-to-one correspondence. But just like in Season of Migration, in Heart of Darkness, this different levels of narration creates a sense of distance and confusion sometimes around who is speaking, around when that part of the text is taking place. And we get this blurring of the unnamed narrator with Mustafa Saeed's narration in a way that really creates anxiety for both the reader, I think, and the narrator. So the unnamed narrator that I'm referring to is the primary narrator, right? In the present of the novel, he has returned to his village in Sudan after earning a PhD in English poetry. This is their newly post-colonial nation. He wants to contribute to it. And at first, we get a sense that he feels relief and happiness to return. But his friendship, if you want to call it that, with Mustafa Saeed provokes feelings of alienation, anxiety, complicity, and ultimately an identity crisis for him that very well almost leads, or perhaps does lead, to his own suicide. Mustafa Saeed, importantly, is of an older generation than the unnamed narrator, though his story is quite similar to the narrator's. In fact, more similar than the narrator would like it to be, right? Just maybe perhaps kind of like that Marlowe-Kurtz twinning that we discussed in Heart of Darkness. We learn that Saeed was an impoverished but very gifted child, and he excels in the colonial school system and moving up the ladder from Khartoum to Cairo to London. And what's interesting is that his success in England, well, arguably all along, requires that he adopt a kind of persona that is built around racist and Orientalist stereotypes of not only African men, but also Arab men. So the sense of, on the one hand, he's African, therefore he is underdeveloped, quote unquote, savage, barbaric, et cetera, and then with the Arabic aspect of being Sudanese, he's given this kind of exoticized character of someone who is, hypersexualized, someone who, is going to maintain like a harem of women. And there's kind of this almost, you could say, like, fetishization or exoticization of him as a person that also is deeply racist and problematic, even when it seems to be, um, you know, represented positively by the people who view him this way. He manipulates these stereotypes very successfully. So he seems unlike the kind of character, if you want to call that, in Black Skin, White Masks. He seems to be very self aware and wield these stereotypes in a way that gives him power and advantage over, especially these English women. That is until he meets his match, Jean Morris, who he marries and then murders. He's then sentenced to prison and then is released finally and does return to Sudan, where he settles down and marries Husna bin Umud. So I think it's important for us to consider all of the ways that his identity is complicated and contradictory and encompasses many things, both things that are imposed on him by the English, but also self-cultivated parts of his anxiety or things that he like participates in. So, we have this idea that he's so good at being in British colonial school system that he's like a quote Black Englishman, some page 44. He's an economist, he's a successful academic. So he's part of the system in this way, but he also is president of the Society for the Struggle of African Freedom. So he's involved with anti-colonial ideas. He is in many ways just a ladies' man, a runaround, right? And there's something kind of liberating and maybe intimidating about reading this part of the text. But he's also unfaithful and psychologically abusive to his lovers, although they are also psychologically abusive to him, you could say. He's a murderer. Is he a sociopath? Is he a traditional Sudanese husband when he returns? And then finally, I think the most interesting thing for us to consider is to what extent is he a conqueror who, engages in reverse conquering of England, or a victim, or both simultaneously? Is he a sympathetic character in this way? Or is he someone who you recoil from? In his own words, he's a lie of his own construction, but also the lie built around the lie of racism, the lie of Orientalism, the lie of white supremacy. Of course, when the unnamed narrator meets Mustafa Saeed, Saeed has settled into this village. No one knows about his past. He's married Hosna bint Mahmud, and he has remained quiet about it until the unnamed narrator provokes him to want to tell him about his past. Interestingly, over this moment of drunkenness in which he recites English poetry.